Okay, having completed the ankle, mid-tarsal and subtalar joints and the muscles that act on these joints, we're going to move into the foot. Now, the foot is a multi-segmented structure. The large joints that we consider at the foot are obviously the talocrural or the ankle joint, the subtalar joint, the mid-tarsal joints, the joints that were reviewed in the previous lecture. But that said, there are a number of other joints, and these are a series of typical synovial plane joints. So between any adjacent tarsal bones, we see the intertarsal joints, collectively known as the intertarsal joints. So over here, we will have the cuneo-navicular joint. So here's the medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, and there's navicular. We have a synovial plane joint between each of these bones. We then have intercuneiform joints, so a joint between the medial and intermediate cuneiform and between the intermediate and lateral cuneiform. Again, another synovial plane joints, very stable joints here, called the intercuneiform joints. And then over here, laterally, we've got the cuneo-cuboid joint. So that's between the lateral cuneiform bone and cuboid. These are typical synovial joints, so they've all got the articular surfaces are all covered in hyaline cartilage. They're surrounded by a double layer, the outer layer being the fibrous capsule, and inside that we've got the synovial membrane that lines the fibrous capsule and attaches to the joint margins. All of these joints are stabilized by a very strong set of dorsal ligaments that pass from the dorsum of one bone through to the dorsum, across to the dorsum of the other bone. Plantar ligaments, which do the same thing on the plantar aspect, but there are also interosseous ligaments. So wherever there's space in between the non-articular portion of the intercuneiform joints, for example, you'll have an interosseous ligament. And these interosseous ligaments are very important because they hold the architecture of the foot. The bases of the metatarsals will articulate with the distal row of tarsal bones. So here we can see the first metatarsal articulating with the medial cuneiform, the second metatarsal slotting into this mortise arrangement that is formed by the three cuneiform bones, making this the most stable of the five metatarsals. The fact that this is the most stable of the five metatarsals means that it doesn't move very much, and this actually becomes the midline of the foot. So when we talk about movements of ab and adduction of, for example, the toes, it's with reference to this stable metatarsal. So the first toe moving medially and the three lateral toes moving laterally are what we classify as abduction. The third metatarsal base articulates with the lateral cuneiform, and the fourth and fifth metatarsals form more mobile joints with cuboid. Okay, again, these are typical synovial joints. Again, they're a series of synovial plane joints that collectively form an irregular joint line, which is known as the tarso-metatarsal joint line. So we've got this kind of zigzaggy shape, red line that we can see going across between the distal row of tarsal bones and the bases of the metatarsals. Again, they're typical synovial joints, so they have synovial capsule, synovial membrane, hyaline cartilages on the surfaces, and ligaments over the dorsum, plantar, and interosseous regions. Three small joints here that exist between the second and third, third and fourth and fifth metatarsals, these green lines that we can see here. Synovial plane joints known as the intermetatarsal joints, again reinforced by dorsal, plantar and interosseous ligaments, with a capsule and synovial membrane surrounding the joint itself. Potential sources of pain can be fairly sensitive joints, so just need to be aware of them. Moving distally, we have at the heads of the metatarsal, so here's the fifth metatarsal, over here we've got the fourth metatarsal, we've got a series of condyloid joints. So we've got the rounded heads of the metatarsals form the ball part of the condyloid joint, and they articulate with the socket at the base of the proximal phalanges of all of the toes. These are the metatarsophalangeal joints, and they are typical synovial condyloid joints. So they are modified ball and socket joints that only allow biaxial movements. So they will allow flexion and extension and ab and adduction. These can be directly compared with the metacarpophalangeal joints that we find in the hand. Now, the joints themselves, the articular surfaces are covered in hyaline cartilage, and we have a capsule that surrounds all the way, that goes all the way around the joint itself. On the inferior aspects, on the plantar aspects of the foot, the capsule is very lax, and most of the support for these joints comes from a series of very tough ligaments, collateral ligaments, one there and one there for this joint, one there and there for this joint, that passes from the tubercles on the heads of the metatarsals. They pass distally to blend into the bases of the proximal phalanges. It's also worthy to note at this point here the existence of these structures here, these green structures that we can see on this diagram here. These are the volar plates, and these are fibrocartilaginous plates whose function is to protect the metatarsal heads during weight bearing when the toes are in extension. So when the toes are up here fully extended, the bases of the metatarsals heads, the hyaline cartilage here, would normally be exposed, and the volar plates are fibrocartilaginous plates that protect this region. When the metacarpals metacarpophalangeal joints move into flexion, the phalanges will move around those metatarsal heads, covering the plantar aspect of these joints. The volar plates are then held together by this red structure that we can see here. This is known as the transverse, and this essentially stops the splaying of the metatarsal heads. A very strong, very stable arrangement holding the metatarsal bases together. In between adjacent phalanges, we have a series of joints called the interphalangeal joints. These are typical synovial hinge joints, so they are uniaxial, and they are formed between the bases of one phalanx against the head of the more proximal phalanx. The first toe, the big toe, has only a single interphalangeal joint, but all of the other joints, all of the other toes have got proximal and a distal interphalangeal joints. These are typical synovial hinge joints, so they only allow uniaxial movements and are reinforced by very strong collateral ligaments. The strong collateral ligaments prevent any abduction or any rotational movement occurring. So moving away from the joints of the foot and looking at the foot as a whole. Now the foot is arranged in a vaulted structure. The foot is bounded by a series of arches, and on this diagram down here we can see there is a medial longitudinal arch. We then have a lateral longitudinal arch of the other side of the foot, and then we have a transverse arch. Okay, so it forms this vault arrangement, this three-pointed vault that we have here. Before we talk about the arches of the foot, we need to describe arch systems. So here we've got this is a typical Roman arch that we have here. And all arches will have their pillars. So here we've got a pillar on one side and a pillar on the other side. And arch support systems come in a variety of ways. The first thing that we have is we often have a keystone. And the keystone is usually the highest point of the arch, where weight of the building is taken down through the keystone and transferred down to the two pillars of the arch. Further support can be offered by bowstrings, for example, where we've got this line going across here. If this was a cord attaching this block to this block, that will be classified as a bowstring. Arches can also be supported by staples. Now, staple is any structure that holds adjacent blocks together. So we've got a block here, a block here. If I put a staple spanning this area, that will be that's a supporting stable. Yeah. Anything that spans more than two blocks is classified as a bowstring. But we can also provide support from above. We could add suspension systems. So we could add ropes, for example, on this arch here to support this pillar, and another rope over here to support this pillar. So all arch support systems will have an identifiable keystone, bowstrings, staples, and suspension systems. And this is true of the arches of the foot. The arches of the foot are important because what they do is the locking and unlocking of the arches of the foot. It leads to changes in the actual foot function itself, the ability for the foot to change from a mobile adapter, from a mobile structure that is required in the early phase of gait or of weight bearing. So as the foot is unlocked, it becomes a soft structure. It allows absorption of forces to a rigid lever during the propulsive phase of gait. So if we start off with the medial longitudinal arch, we can see the medial longitudinal arch here. So if we start off describing the pillars, the posterior pillar is the calcaneus, the anterior pillar is made up of the navicular, the 3 cuneiform bones and the 3 metatarsals. The phalanges do not form part of the medial longitudinal arch, or of any of the arches in fact. The keystone, the highest point of the arch, is the talus. So the weight comes down here through the tibia and fibula. About 50% of our body weight goes backwards to the calcaneus, and about 50% of our body weight goes forward to the anterior portion. Support is offered via a number of structures. We have the spring ligaments passing from the sustentaculum tali here to the plantar aspect of the navicular, a very strong component. This holds that keystone up. We then have the short plantar ligament, this blue structure that we can see here, and the long plantar ligaments. They act as bowstrings. And then a very important semi-dynamic structure is the plantar aponeurosis here, the medial half of the plantar aponeurosis. Now I say this is a semi-dynamic structure because what this does is it adheres very firmly to the tubercles on the calcaneus here. Distally, it blends into the bases of the phalanges, and as we dorsiflex the toes, so as the toes get pulled up, the plantar aponeurosis gets pulled tight around the metatarsophalangeal joints, and as it gets pulled tight, tension in the medial aponeurosis will tighten up the arch. It will lift the medial longitudinal arch and provide stability. In addition to that, we have structures like the tendons of tibialis posterior that comes from above and attaches onto the navicular. We have the tendons of tibialis anterior that comes down to the medial cuneiform and first metatarsal, and the tendons of flexor hallucis longus and flexor digitorum longus will also provide dynamic support. These are very important during dynamic activities. Some of the smaller muscles of the foot that we'll talk about in a second will also contribute to stability of the arches, of the medial longitudinal arch. The lateral longitudinal arch is far less stable than the medial one. It is formed by, over here we've got cuboid, which forms the keystone. The calcaneus forms the posterior arch again, and the lateral 2 metatarsals that are very mobile, that are quite mobile, form the anterior arch, or the anterior pillars. Far less stable than the medial longitudinal arch, and often when we go into weight bearing, these 2 metatarsals will dorsiflex and it will look like the lateral arch almost disappears. Again, support is offered from both the short plantar ligament again here and the long plantar ligament, as well as the lateral portion of the plantar aponeurosis. Peroneus longus that comes through in the small groove on the underside of cuboid, and peroneus brevis that comes down and attaches onto the styloid process on the base of the 5th metatarsal, become important dynamic structures for the lateral longitudinal arch, as well as flexor digitorum longus and some of the smaller intrinsic muscles of the foot. When we look at the transverse arches, there are 2 parts to the transverse arches. There's an anterior part and a posterior part. The posterior portion is formed by cuboid and the 3 cuneiform coming together, and the arch is only really complete when we have both feet together, because this forms one pillar and the same bones on the opposite side form the other pillar. Support is offered predominantly by the ligaments and the shapes of the bones, the shapes of the actual cuneiform bones, and the introsseous ligaments of the intercuneiform joints are very, very important at holding these arches stable. The anterior part of the arch is made from the metatarsal heads. So there's my 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th. And the 2nd metatarsal head is typically the keystone here. And this should be the highest point of the transverse arch. Again, this is a very mobile arch with the only real supporting structure coming from the transverse head of adductor hallucis, which is one of the small intrinsic muscles of the foot. And as soon as we go into weight bearing, it would appear that the 5 arches tend to sit in a straight line. The position of the 2nd metatarsal head in non-weight bearing is important. It needs to be higher than the others, because if this 2nd metatarsal head drops down, sits in this plantar flex position, so it sits underneath the other components, this becomes the first part of the anterior arch that comes in contact with the ground, which can then lead to an irritation of the 2nd metatarsal head, a condition known as metatarsalgia. As said earlier, the role of the arches of the foot is to allow the foot to change shape. These are dynamic arches. They're not these static, rigid structures, but they're dynamic arches that have the ability to unlock by reducing the supportive component, by reducing the close packing of the joints, and releasing the muscles that would support these joints. And that gives us a dynamic component, the ability to unlock and mold to the surfaces that the foot is actually weight bearing on. They're also important for shock absorption and weight dissipation. We get transfer of weight along the posterior pillars and the anterior pillars. And as such, when we look at the trabecular arrangement of these bones, we see the trabeculae here of the tibia coming down here, the trabeculae of the talus going in different directions, and again the trabeculae of the calcaneus and metatarsals going in different directions. And this is for weight dissipation. The trabeculae are there to withstand compressive longitudinal forces.